My apologies to liturgically sensitive listeners for my yellow hoodie and my purple Lenten stole, and for the out-of-season cherries, for that matter. Now, on Monday, the Armchair Preachers, which is a gathering we have here on Mondays in Lent, wondered what the word for this week would be, because the first week it turned out to be fear, and the second week it was loss, and the third week it was thirst. If there is a single word to categorize this homily, maybe you can figure it out. But for any of us who grew up in the Christian church, the story we just heard has been misnamed or mistitled The Prodigal Son. The emphasis being on prodigal, and that's because Christianity loves sin, or loves to hate sin and loves to talk about it. So sin-loving theologians and guilt-stoking preachers seem to think the focus of this story is on the youngest son, who is, of course, a major league sinner. But the story, even as Luke tells it, is about a parent with two children. A parent with two children. You could call it a father with two sons, but the gender of every one of the main characters could be switched out, and it can be a mother and two daughters, and it would be the same story. So in this sense, because it's Jesus telling it, the story is about God much more than the sons. And when the focus shifts to the sons, it's a story as much about the choice of the oldest sibling as it is about the choices of the youngest sibling. Now, I'm pretty sure that there is more than one person listening here on this video and in this congregation when we're all gathered in person who might have been a prodigal son or daughter. And most adults I know who were wayward at one point in their life and then journeyed back to a more typical human imperfection like this story a lot. And one of the things that we like about it, especially if you happen to be the youngest child, which I am, and that is the finger-wagging oldest child is left holding a bag with a sneer on his face. I have also discovered that oldest children, and even some middle kids, often do not feel warm and fuzzy about this story in the same way the prodigal or the youngest child does. Instead, their response is something like, "Now, isn't that just like the youngest, messing up and getting away with it?" But either way, like all of Jesus' stories, it has a barbed hook in it for all of us, regardless of our birth order. The story of the parent with two children is poignant and sweet, painful and challenging, no matter which character we identify with. The two sons make starkly different choices, and yet the father neither affirms nor critiques either choice. That right there should blow our minds. The events of this story, like life itself, demonstrate that we live with the consequences of our choices. We live with the consequences of our choices. But the action and the punchline of the story really hinge like a door on that dad or that mom. The dad's exuberant joy upon the youngest son's return is like a shiny object that catches our attention. We get all caught up with the dad's abundant generosity, either with appreciation for it or discomfort that the youngest son is getting away with something. But the story's not over. While the dad welcomes the youngest son back, he welcomes the oldest son in. The dad reaches across the angry, bitter resentment of hurt and indignation and invites the oldest son to stay connected. Basically, the dad says to the oldest son, "What's mine is yours." Now, the extravagant love of the father is extended to both sons with unbelievable excessiveness. His love is not predicated on any particular choice that either of the sons makes. be they good or bad or ugly choices, the love remains the same. Now, who loves like that? Love not connected to the choices we make? Love not tied to a string at the other end of a condition? Love centered in something utterly differentiated from the actions of the person being loved? Who loves like that? Those of us who have been raised on the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches of popular Christianity get smug about the prodigal son story, as if such extravagant love is a unique characteristic of our religion. You know, like in those awful camp songs, like, they'll know we are Christians by our love, as if our love is better or different than any other religion's love. But centuries before Jesus was a gleam in Joseph and Mary's eyes, if you get what I'm saying, God took the hand of a people who had been raised as mules and brought them through a scorching desert and set them all around a dinner table on the plains of Jericho and fed them. And here's where the two biblical stories we heard today come together. All the way along Israel's ordeal, escaping from the slave masters, surviving in the wilderness, living through anxiety and fear, rebellion and chaos and isolation, God fed them with this mysterious and apparently naturally formed substance that would keep them alive. Manna, the sweet bread of wilderness survival, which is actually a thing. We heard about it today in Joshua, that having crossed the Jordan River, which, by the way, throughout the Bible is the boundary between wilderness and promise, God gives them this Passover meal. And after the Passover meal, manna disappears forever. It cannot be a coincidence that there is no manna in the Promised Land. There is no manna in the Promised Land. Manna is what sustains us when we don't have choices, when we're powerless. In those unusual times when we find ourselves on a bobsled chute going down a fast course that God or fate or serendipity or randomness seems to have shoved us into, the Exodus Joshua story says that God takes responsibility to sustain us with manna. In such hazardous or traumatic times, manna may not turn out to be, or actually manna may turn out to be actual bread, or it might be emotional nurture, or it could be a community of people to hold us up, or a power greater than ourselves we don't perceive at the time or know about until later. In such times of trauma or hazard, and I know we've all had them, we almost never realize that we are being sustained with some kind of manna until afterwards. It's when we look back and we suddenly realize we could never have made it on our own. Someone or something was there as we needed it to be to keep us going. But the Exodus Joshua story says out loud that when we get to the Promised Land, or as the story of the parent with 2 children calls it, when we come to our senses, think wokeness, it is then that we must start living again by our own choices. And it's then that the manna ceases. Now, a lot of Christians say things like, well, put God in the driver's seat, even though God doesn't have a driver's license. If we expect God to run our lives, we're going to have a horrible, horrible crash. And a lot of people, Christian or not, will say things like, oh, it's all good, or it was meant to be, as if we have no agency and the other choices we made or make don't matter. But according to the biblical vision of reality, the promised land is the place where we get to make our own choices and where we get to live with the consequences of our own choices. Those two things go together, where we live with the choices and we live with the consequences of our choices. The biblical point of view is that of former slaves. The promised land is a place where we have freedom of choice, unfettered by powers greater than ourselves making decisions for us, like Pharaoh or even God. The promised land is the place of choice, where we do not need to be sustained by manna, because we are making the choices that not only sustain us, but contribute to the sustenance of the whole community. There is no manna in the promised land, and we need to stop looking for it. The prodigal son does not expect to return and be rich. Now hear this. His recovery, which certainly was a recovery from substance abuse, among other things, his recovery is based upon his acceptance of the consequences of the choices he made. His recovery is based on the realization that if he's going to be a laborer instead of a prince, he knows that being a laborer in the service of his father is better than being a laborer in the service of somebody who doesn't care about him. There is no proposal from either the youngest son or the father that he gets to return as a prince. The dad welcomes him back with excessive love, but there's no hint that he means to be saved from the consequences of his choices. He gets a feast, not an inheritance. He gets work and wages, not privilege. Likewise, the dad offers the oldest son a bridge back into the household, but he's perfectly willing to let the oldest son suffer the consequences of his resentment, if that's the choice he wants to make. The promised land is the one in which we have freedom to make choices, in which we have the accountability to live with the consequences of our choices, and in which our only hope is a kind of communalism that creates a supreme interdependence in which we sink or swim together. Manna is only for those who are on their way in or out of, even if they don't know it yet, a pigsty of one kind or another. I truly believe there are precious times when we are, in fact, sustained by some kind of manna. But we only have it briefly, just long enough to get to the Jordan River and to cross back into the land of choices. But those are rare and unpredictable moments, and we should never go seek them or count on them. The times of manna are utter gifts. So the prodigal son story, which is really about the dad, is just another version of an ancient covenant that God made with those mule people 1,200 years before Jesus was born. It's a relationship of promise. And the promise is this: God loves us. God loves us so extravagantly that regardless of the choices we make, we will be greeted on the road of return with a warm coat and an even warmer embrace. But, and this is part of the promise too, that radically extravagant love does not save us from our choices. In fact, God promises that we will be given freedom to live with the consequences of our choices. That's the promised land, and we live in it. Now, I sometimes get to the end of a sermon like this one, and I say to myself, what the heck did I say that has value to anyone? But you know, we need to be reminded that we are living in the promised land, And it is a place where our choices matter. Even the little choices we make matter. That magical manna that saved us once when we were powerless or in trouble isn't available to us here in the Promised Land. It's our choices that matter. You and I. You and I are sons and daughters in that story. And we're not the father or the mother. So I guess it just comes down to that. Thinking about our choices, coming to our senses, accepting God's extravagant love, and then getting back to work when the party's over. I hope that helps. Peace be with you.